We do each and every Tuesday, the final time we chat with him here on 97.3 ESPN in the year 2020. He is the big man on campus, Barstool Sports, the one and only, at Jeff Nadu on Twitter. As all guests, he appears on the Boardwalk kind of hotline. Make sure you check out the latest episode of the Big Man on Basketball podcast. I mean, just tons of great college basketball content on there. Jeff, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, guys. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Appreciate the plug. Got some NBA stuff as well. Always very basketball driven. So thank you for the plug. Appreciate it.
Well, I'm plugging on purpose also because I was listening to it last night, and I kind of had a big picture question of some of the things you guys are talking about. We were talking about Gonzaga and Kentucky and everything. And when it comes to college basketball, and I'm just curious of your perspective on this. When we get closer to March and we start looking ahead to the tournaments and the conference championships and the NCAA tournament, it's starting to feel, at least to me, like with all of these reschedules and these cancellations and these things moving around and, Mike Krzyzewski putting his tail between his legs and running away from out-of-conference opponents, it feels like a lot of these schedules and the strength of schedule is going to be really obtuse and maybe hard to differentiate some this year.
Yeah, it definitely is going to be. Obviously, there's still the same principles, but yeah, with all the cancellations, and there's been a lot of really tough cancellations. I mean, a lot of good games. I mean, Gonzaga, Baylor, and some of the other ones that were canceled. It seems like a lot of the good games have been canceled. So it's definitely going to be a little bit different from a committee standpoint. But, the good thing about teams, it's really going to hurt seeding and that kind of thing. But, yeah, I'll let, Lenardi and all those guys in the committee handle that. But, I use some metrics to just kind of figure out strength of schedule and kind of use those sorts of things. But, it's definitely going to be tougher, a lot of neutral courts and just weird scheduling things. You have conferences that are doing back-to-backs this year in conference play, so that's kind of interesting. So, yeah, all sorts of different stuff thrown in that you would normally throw in. I actually I just completed an interview for tomorrow's show with Chris Mooney, who is the coach of the Richmond Spiders, one of the great mid-major programs. And we talked about kind of the situation. They had a COVID stoppage and just it really seemed like hell just trying to schedule games and as a team kind of put it through. So I think at the end of the season, a team like Richmond is a team that I want because they're so experienced. They have a ton of continuity. So finding those teams is really going to be what you want, I think.
And it's interesting because you mentioned Richmond. They're already 6-2, so they've gotten 8 games in this year. And you guys mentioned on the pod when I was listening last night how loaded this A-10 conference is going to be. A team like them, if they make it out of that conference, they could be a serious team to watch for in the tournament.
Yeah, no, they definitely are. And I picked them number 1 in this conference. I think they're an at-large team even if they weren't to win this conference tournament. I think they can get in. They have some really good non-con wins. And, like I said, one of the oldest teams in the country, a lot of continuity. They have a really fun offense. They run a Princeton-style offense. And, as I said, they're really mentally strong. And Coach Mooney was talking to me about that, about how, last year they were 24-7 and basically – a possible berth was ripped from their hands by something they couldn't control. And I think a lot of the kids coming back this year is a lot more mentally strong. They had a player that tore his ACL that they had to go through all this cancellation stuff. So, there's a lot of mentally strong will on this team. So, they're a team that I actually think can make a run like a Loyola did a couple of years ago. Richmond's really good, and I'm interested in seeing what Coach Mooney can do. And Coach Mooney's a Philly guy. We talked about some Philly sports stuff, so it's good to see him doing well and them doing well.
Of course, he gets that on tomorrow's episode of the Big Man on Basketball podcast. Hit that subscribe button, iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, whatever your platform is. Big Man on Basketball podcast. Subscribe. Make sure you get tomorrow's episode with Coach Mooney of the Richmond Spiders. You mentioned Philly. That's one of the things I wanted to ask you about because you guys didn't really touch on it too much. I want to know what your perspective is of this Villanova team because they had the game this Saturday. I was looking forward to a lot. Canceled. Just pulled up the schedule because of COVID issues. What is your perspective on Villanova this year?
Yeah, I mean, I actually heard someone the other day. I don't know if it was a talking head. It was just someone I guess I kind of respect on Twitter. He mentioned that he thought Villanova was the second best team in the country, and I thought that was a little rich. I think Villanova is really good, and I think from an offensive standpoint, they're right up there. Gonzaga and Baylor are right there, but they're right there as well. I guess some of my concerns would just be on the defensive end. I mean, they've had some real concerns this year. I mean, Virginia Tech was a tough one. This is a team, though, that has seemed to kind of figure it out. They've looked really good in conference play so far, but they played a lot of teams in conference in Georgetown and Butler that are kind of down. Beating Marquette by 17, though, is impressive. That's a good Marquette team, but this is what Villanova is, and I know recently they had a stoppage. I think Coach Wright, Jay, has COVID, so they're going to be off for a little bit. I think the game on Saturday was postponed, but this team is really good. Another really experienced team, a lot of continuity. They don't go real deep, but the starting five is as good a starting five as you'll find. They shoot a lot of threes. They get a lot of threes from the offense from the three-point line, but that's something that Jay does. They're number one in the country in turnover percentage, so they just don't beat themselves. And those are the kind of teams I want to back. I said before, and I'll say it again, I don't think they have any trouble in this conference. I think the only teams that give them a little trouble would be obviously Xavier, who's been incredible, and then Seton Hall, who's actually played a lot better lately. But outside of that, Villanova should cruise probably to a number one seed, at worst number two. And I think they're probably third or fourth in kind of the pecking order in the country right now.
He's Jeff Nadu, Big Man on Campus. Make sure you get the Big Man on Basketball podcast. Follow him on Twitter for all of his latest picks and thoughts at Jeff Nadu on Twitter. Jeff, I want to flip it over to the NBA because, early on from a betting perspective, one of the things I'm noticing, at least, because I don't consider myself as someone who's as sharp and as wise as you are when it comes to this stuff, but at least from my perspective, I'm noticing that the NBA, a lot of overs are hitting early on. Is that just because defense is slow getting out of the gate, or is some of these offenses just maybe a little bit better than we thought?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty astute point. I mean, you look at outside of 5 teams in the NBA, the rest of the league has went over at least once. So, there are a lot of teams that are going over. You look at, there are 4 teams that are perfect from an over perspective. We're only 3 games into the season, but yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with what the league is now. And it's funny because I've talked about this kind of ad nauseum. There's teams that we've kind of assumed are good defensively that even last year and then this year aren't. So like Utah, a prime example, the Utah Jazz last year were 15th in the NBA in defensive efficiency. The 2 years before that, they were first and second. So defensively, they've dropped off. You look at a team like Boston. Boston has the worst defensive efficiency in the NBA right now. Teams are just, I think from a pace perspective, they're just kind of higher. And look, there's a lot of really good players in the NBA now. So Houston, they went kind of from the wayside defensively. They lose, Robert Covington and Clint Capella last year. So there's some weird things going on. Philadelphia hasn't been exactly showstoppers defensively. So I think it'll all come to a head. It's early, but that's a good, astute point by you.
Is there a team or a situation in the NBA right now that maybe has surprised you or stood out to you early on? Like you said, it's only 3 games into the year for a lot of these teams, but I feel like we're already starting to see some very interesting and bizarre things early on. Yeah,
one thing that I will continue to hammer home, if you're laying double digits in the NBA, you're going to lose long term. In fact, you're going to probably lose pretty poorly. To continue to lay 12, 13, 11 with certain teams. I mean, case in point, Monday evening, you had you had a team like Atlanta, the Atlanta Hawks, one of the worst defensive teams in the league last year, one of the worst offensive teams in the league last year. Why were they 10.5-point favorites last night? If anyone can tell me, I'd like to hear it. I know Detroit's bad, but we have to understand that even the bad teams in the NBA are still really good. They're professionals. They're 450 of the best players in the world. And, when someone's out, teams generally step up. So I would highly recommend, if you're seeing teams laying double digits, it's got to be a really good situation. And it's funny that you asked this because tonight, Tuesday night, there's actually a really interesting spot. The LA Clippers are 10.5-point favorites against the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now, the Clippers, I'm not going to lie to you guys, Sunday's performance was one of the most putrid, disgusting performances I've ever seen on a level of basketball ever. I mean, it was embarrassing. To be down 50 at halftime is hard to do. I'm going to say from a standpoint from the Clippers, I think we see a really good effort from them tonight. Minnesota is a team that, is without Karl Towns right now. They just got blown out against the Lakers the other night. Now you got to go on the road again and stay in LA and play the Clippers. Then you got to go back home and have a homestand and then go back on the road. So I think the Clippers get right tonight. That would be a spot I would consider laying double digits in, but it's got to be a perfect spot for me to lay double digits. If it's not, I'm going to fade it every time.
He's the big man on campus at Jeff Nadu on Twitter, co-host of the Big Man on Basketball podcast. Jeff, you mentioned double digits. That's kind of the last thing I want to get to with you is this Friday we're going to have the College Football National Championship semifinals. And most people believe that Alabama is going to beat Notre Dame. I think anybody who thinks Notre Dame is going to win is probably just a Notre Dame homer, and they're completely delirious. Maybe Notre Dame fans are as bad as Kentucky fans, if not worse. But with that being said, Alabama's covered that big spread 8 of the last 10 games this year. Is it safe to jump on Alabama on a big spread again in a big spot like this?
No, I don't think it is. Just because I don't think Notre Dame's going to win, clearly. But I think defensively, you can make the case they're the best defense in this group of 4. They have a good quarterback. They're always good at the skill positions. And Alabama's, I know you mentioned that they've kind of been good in these spots, but, that was against teams like Washington and like Pac-12 opponents. Notre Dame's kind of a different animal. No, I would not lay it. In fact, if I were to play this, I would take the points. I'll obviously wish that it would get up to 21. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think a lot of bettors will kind of be in the thought process that Alabama's just going to cruise. But I'm not real in love with laying big numbers with them on a regular basis. Look, if they're playing Kentucky or Vandy, then fine. But on a stage like this, I would lean with taking the points. In the other game, look, I think Ohio State's terrific, but I think Clemson's ultimately going to win again. I just love what they have. I love Lawrence, and we're going to get Alabama Clemson, so I'm looking forward to it. But 2 games that have they're really tough to gauge.
You're ready for the man himself, the big man on campus, Jeff Nadu, at Jeff Nadu on Twitter, the Big Man on Basketball podcast. His interview with Richmond basketball head coach Mooney tomorrow on the podcast as our guest. He appeared on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Jeff, appreciate the time and Happy New Year, my friend.
Hey, appreciate it, guys. Thanks for having me on. Same to you.